So Arthur is coming this week. If you haven't signed up, you need to sign up. It is on Thursday, and we are very excited for this discussion. This is sort of the preview, right, to get us ready to hear his topic, but also that we can take the message from this book, from the sermon series, and have Trinity be a place that we can love each other more and have better conversations and welcome people in, and then go out into places where we are not always with the people who think just like us. Let me give a brief overview for those who haven't been here the last couple of weeks. I'll give a quick precursor, and then we'll launch into the chapters for today. So Arthur's book, Love Your Enemies, is a book about challenging the culture of contempt, our addiction to contempt. And he talks about contempt as being a mix between disgust and anger, about thinking of someone who just disagrees with us as less than human, and the quintessential look for that is the eye roll, or the shrug, or the eye roll, and says that when you find yourself doing that, you might have a little bit of contempt. So, and how often do we find that? And he talks about how our country is addicted to contempt. It's within our political leadership. It's what we hear. It's what we see in the poisonous discussions on social media. It is where we go only to have our own thoughts and biases confirmed by going to certain media sources, or only hanging around those who agree with us. And because we are all here today, we know that we don't hang around people who agree with us, because in this room we don't agree with each other, which is a fantastic and wonderful thing at this church. Let me talk about his rules, because we began with the rules. And so let me go over them again. We've gone over them for 3 weeks, and I just think it's helpful for us to hear a little bit about what he says are the lessons and the rules. And he talks about what is the antidote to contempt? The antidote to contempt is love. And it's also showing gratitude. And here are his rules. Number one rule, hello. Number one rule, do you remember? Say no to the man. Say no to the man. Say no to that in the culture that drives us to think only of ourselves. And when you hear someone trying to say always, you are right, then you're probably being used by someone, by the more powerful, and that you need to reject that. Rule number 2, escape the bubble. Go where you're not invited and say things that people don't expect. Go to those who don't agree with you and talk to them and embrace them in love. Number 3, say no to contempt. Treat others with love and respect, even when it is hard. And it is hard. There is nothing, Arthur will say during his talk, there is nothing easy about what is the prescription in love your enemies, which is also probably why Jesus told us to do that. Disagree better is the 4th rule. Be a part of a healthy competition of ideas, but not part of belittling the other. And the final one, he says, is tune out. Disconnect more from unproductive debates. Engage more in productive debates. Tune out that which is negative or is treating the other as the other, but embrace warm-heartedness. So then last week, we went through a couple of chapters. We did a chapter on, can you afford to be nice? The answer is yes. For those who weren't here, I will short-circuit it. The answer is yes, you can afford to be nice. And we talked all about the reasons why being nice is actually good for you. It's good for the culture. And yes, you can afford to be nice. And actually, people are viewed better when they are nice. Leaders are better and viewed better when they are nice. But it's not just about what's good for you, it's about what is good for those of us who are just trying to get along better with others. We had a great question, and we'll urge you to answer, or not answer questions. You can answer questions too if you want. We urge you to ask questions if you would like as we go along, because we talked all about authoritarian leadership or versus authoritative leadership, and how that is what Jesus modeled for us, what MLK modeled for us. Today, we're going to walk through a few more chapters. We're going to walk through chapter 5, which is the power and peril of identity. We're going to walk through my favorite chapter in the entire book, which is chapter 6, called Tell Me a Story, which appeals to litigators among us, because that's what we do, is we tell stories. And then we're going to talk about the chapter called Is Competition Our Problem? About the competition of ideas. So with that background, let me bring up the good Reverend Lamont. Anything you want to add before we get going?
No, that was great. I've got a hot mic. Does somebody have the controls? There we go. Okay. Thanks, Alan. I'm just a little hot, or maybe I'm just standing too close to Bill. I can stand a little bit farther from the... Let's test it.
How about that? There we go.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Right, good.
So before we kick off this week's chapters, are there things that were lingering for you all that you wanted to bring up from last week that we can try to cover? Leaning into the book, not just, here's something I'd love to talk about. Nothing? Okay, great. Well, then we'll go straight into, as Bill said, the chapter on identity. And so just to sort of frame up where we are for those of you who are joining us, this whole book, and I'm going to say something about this in the sermon today as well, is about how we're living in a culture of contempt. And Arthur Brooks is trying to get concrete about why that is, but more importantly about how to get out of that practice. So how we, as plain old people who do not change the systems very quickly, can participate in our culture without contributing to more contempt. So each of his chapters is a focus area, and he's a social scientist, so he uses lots of studies and tells lots of stories and things that he thinks help illuminate the culture we're in and how we might engage it differently. And the next chapter is one about identity. And he starts with, how many people have actually read the book? You can be honest. Okay, oh great, more than last week, fantastic. We're getting there. By Thursday, you will all have read the book or listened to it on Audible. So he opens with this interesting list of descriptors of 4 people. And until you know why he's listing them, they seem like 4 people who would not be in the same space, who would not be in a community together. And he does that on purpose to sort of tee us up to be falling into our natural stereotypes and assumptions about people. He just gives a description, and then spoiler, later in the chapter, you find out that the 4 people he's described are his own family. And the 4 people in his immediate family are quite a diverse bunch of people, because Arthur Brooks's wife is from Spain. They have an adopted child. They have a biological child. And so when they are together in the world, they do not look as people might assume families look, and they have a very immediate experience of the power and peril of identity, particularly stereotypes. So he gives this other example, which I think is great, that there are 3 identities that in the first 10 seconds you talk to somebody, you will know whether they have them. If you haven't read the book, people who've read the book will know this answer. If you have not and are willing to say so, what are the identities people lead with when you meet them? What did you say, Mark? Their profession. Body language. How you present yourself. Thanks, Sam. Body language. I know people are listening online. I'm going to try to repeat what's said, and then when we get to real questions, Velma will help run microphones. What else do people tell you about themselves quickly? Where they're from. Yes. Something about their family. Who your people are, as my grandmother says. Who are your people? She means it to be nice, I think. I'll ask her. He uses 3 very specific examples of things that you know in 10 seconds about somebody. If they're a Harvard alum, if they're a former Marine, and if they're vegan.
I was going to add Duke grad to that, too.
Duke grad, they lead loud. May God bless us through basketball season. Duke grads, they sometimes do tell you they just work it in subtly, right? It's not like, I'm a Duke grad. It's like, well, when I was at Duke. That's a bonding identity. We're going to come back to that in just a few minutes. So the point Arthur Brooks is trying to make is that these are things we share about each other, and sometimes that's very positive. Why is it good to share identities? Connections. Thank you, Brenda. You find commonality with someone. You can sort of place each other quickly. I mean, all jokes aside about my grandmother, when she says, who are his people? She's really not starting from a place of judgment. She wants to figure out whether she knows them, right? She wants to know, how am I connected to those people? And if you're from a small place, the chances are pretty good. So it's a shorthand for getting connected and feeling closer to somebody. What's the flip side to that? You don't belong. Right. I want to know if you and I share something of value. And if we do, I'm going to celebrate that. And if we don't, I may immediately see you differently because of the identities we've shared, right? This is a natural way that we quickly either bond or don't. So in this chapter, he spends a good bit of time talking about how we use identity, sometimes to great positive effect to build community, and sometimes to separate ourselves and even to define enemy relationships. He uses this language of enemy. And he uses this later in the chapter, we might just call it an other relationship. Someone is other to us, and that's even a verb in our culture now. Othering somebody is identifying what separates you, what distances you from each other. Bill, what you want to add on to that?
So it's interesting when Arthur uses an example in this, which he may talk about on Thursday, about a study of this bonding versus bridging characteristic. So he speaks of bringing people together as bridging, right? But how many of us are engaged in bonding? We are, in many ways, quintessential bonders here at the Presbyterian Church. It is a wonderful thing that we all share. We share going here. We love being here. But is that something that is dividing, or is it something that is together? And he talks about those different characteristics and says that we need to look at what is bonding. There is not a problem with bonding characteristics. But if it becomes something that, as Rebekah talked about, that is then exclusive, that is something where we look at it and it is creating somebody as the other, that it creates a blockade, a moat around this or around what we're doing, then it is not bridging the gap, bridging that divide.
Yeah, so he uses a lot of research that's actually Robert Putnam's research. And I'm a fan of Robert Putnam. Maybe we could get him to come sometime. Yeah. He was one of the first people to use the language of social capital. You all have heard this language, that we have certain assets, right, that we might call capital. That's an economic term for them, but we each have something. And some of them are tangible and quantifiable, and we could count them. Others of them are personal, and they may be emotional or relational, and they're a little bit harder to quantify, but just as important to what we bring to the world. So social capital, Robert Putnam defined in 2 ways. And all jokes aside, I'll use my friend Jim Blitch as an example here. So bonding social, is that okay, Jim?
Depends on the example, he says.
He's like, I'll let you know later if it was okay. Bonding social capital are the things that we can immediately identify as a group. Like, we all love fill in the blank, right? We went to Duke. That's an easy one. We went to Carolina. That's an easy one, right? I am bonded forever with those people, even if I didn't know them in college, even if I've never had any interaction with them. Very quickly, we're going to share a bond. That's good and bad, because that is an inward-facing bond that immediately, to use Bill's language of a moat, puts us on an island and separates us from other people. Another type of social capital, which takes more work and interrogation, Robert Putnam calls bridging social capital. The language tells you what it is. It's finding the commonality that builds a bridge from one group to another. So zooming your identity out from the most obvious insular to something that's a shared experience or value. So Jim went to Duke, I went to Carolina. We're great friends, in part because we are bridged by our shared human experience and our shared value. So if anything important came up between us, we would immediately put aside the Duke and Carolina situation because we value something more important and lasting than that. Is that true, Jim Blitch? Okay. I'm way out on a limb here. Way out on a limb here. But I knew that to be true. So we can bridge because we have bothered to get to know each other and to find the shared experience and values between us and to get past the easier, more insular identities. So one of the things that Arthur Brooks observes is that if we don't do that work of finding the bridging social capital, the things that we share, then our culture quite easily exists in these pods of insular, inward-looking identity where people do not really know each other, respect each other, love each other. And that's one of the reasons we fall into this culture of contempt.
Along those lines, I actually thought this was there's a lot of fascinating quotes in this particular chapter, but one that was interesting to me, he said, this is actually hard, what Rebekah just described, in the short run. That is not a state that we are in. That's not a state that we currently exist in. For the most part, there is a lot of othering, a lot of bonding, but not bridging. And he said this, he said, forcing people together, but emphasizing differences. So bringing people together so you can talk about how you're different, he said that can be toxic. But if we bring people together and emphasize our common stories, we can discover the new and broader we that is what is required to overcome mutual contempt. But that's a wonderful aspirational state. It's a wonderful quote, but that is what we have. And I was thinking about this when just this week I was at a fascinating conference for a client, and we had a panel on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they put up across the screen their 15 different affinity groups that they divide all of their employees into, to give them the opportunity to go and bond with that particular group. And that was held up as a good thing. And it actually probably is a good thing because there's a shared vision for this company, but they were allowing them to come together to be with others in that company that were like them, that had a shared, racial characteristic, a shared religious characteristic, a shared, other types of characteristics that they shared. But I was looking at it and thinking that because I had just was thinking about this particular chapter, if those 15 groups aren't bridged and aren't talking with one another, then you just have 15 separate bonding identities within this company. And so instead of having the 15 and then they showed the little lines going down, there actually needed to be the lines going across. And that is really what we have to work on to achieve. Velma. And that is what, so Velma just asked, isn't the company the bridge? And that was exactly what they were saying, that their shared values of the company, one of their values, of course, was respect for diversity and inclusion among all those. But you have to work to make sure that I don't think of myself as a X lawyer, right, or a Y lawyer, that you're not defining yourself by that type, but you're defining yourself by the work for the values of that particular company.
He makes the point, I think we can't say it strongly enough, that you just said, Bill, that it does not work for people to just be thrown together and to duke it out, right? So it doesn't work to say, you two see the world totally differently, don't know each other, don't respect each other, but go over here and just talk until you do. Maybe you could talk long enough to get there, but that's part of the reason that we continue in ways of contempt. So one of the examples he gives, which is a really powerful one, is how we can move from being on opposite sides, if you will, so even our physical positioning being adversarial, to standing on the same side and working together towards something else. And as we're working, coming to know each other as people, as our stories, as our shared experience, so that the attempt to prove our rightness or persuade someone else of their wrongness is not our focus, but we're focused together on something else. So he tells the story of Father Greg Boyle out in LA. Have y'all read anything or know anything about him? Yes, it's remarkable, this story. So he's a clergyman who lives in LA, and as you all probably have seen over years in the news, there's a pretty significant gang presence in LA. And so Father Boyle saw an opportunity, particularly for young people who have found identity in gangs. So gangs, most of the young people who end up in gangs are not seeking that way of life. They are seeking affiliation and identity, sometimes even safety, as strange as that might sound to our ears. And so their presence there is in some ways creating a bonded identity group. Knowing that this is a dangerous life, one that can actually shorten lifespan, Father Boyle has created this incredible series of really businesses and entrepreneurial opportunities, starting with a bakery. It was called Homeboy Bakery, and now it has all of these other arms under an umbrella called Homeboy Industries. And Father Boyle invites young members of gangs in LA to come have jobs. But they have to work alongside someone whose affiliation was a rival gang. And so instead of those young people being out trying to prove the betterness of their gang, or worse, committing horrible violence against each other, he removes them from that context. He removes them from any argument about one bonded group being better than another and gives them a shared task. I envision it quite literally. They're standing in a bakery on the same side of the counter, rolling out pastries, right? Getting to know the person who's next to them, talking, and suddenly becoming human for each other. Not suddenly, over time, becoming human for each other because they tell their stories and how they ended up there in the first place. And since the Tell Your Story chapter is your favorite, do you want to kick that off?
I got a story to tell you. Just kidding. So he bridges from this description of people who have the bonding social capital and the bridging social capital into the discussion about Father Boyle, and then tell me a story. And so for those of us who are, many of us in the room are lawyers, we know that here's what you can't ever do. You cannot ever pound someone into submission with what you believe with facts. They just don't care about the facts. But people care about stories. They care about individuals. They care about hearing something about someone that you can humanize, not dehumanizing, but humanizing. And so I was thinking about this just from the standpoint of our political leaders who use stories, and probably the greatest storyteller of any president that we've ever had was Ronald Reagan and Abraham Lincoln. Were probably, I would say, would be the two greatest storytellers Some may disagree. Some may say that there are others, but those were actually my two when I was thinking about that, because they were able to humanize people in furtherance of, in Lincoln's case, of course, the greatest crisis that our country has ever faced. And Brooks says, he had a great quote in here, if I can find it, which is that. No, I'm not going to be able to find it, but I'll tell. Oh, here it is. That fact-based arguments, he says, don't persuade people very well. People don't respond like computers. He said, you will question my motives for what I am saying sooner than you will question your own beliefs. He says, instead of confirmation bias, he says the term is my side bias. I have my side bias. And that people are remarkably good about finding the weakness in others' arguments, but not their own. And that is why stories about real people, and he uses this wonderful example. See if this resonates with you. According to the latest surveys, priests and Levites are 42.3% less likely than Samaritans to help travelers on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, on which violent crime has increased significantly in the last decade. Is that better, or is the story of the Good Samaritan the better story?
Maybe both.
Maybe both.
It's interesting because Arthur Brooks is a social scientist and has worked in economics. And so his instinct is toward data. And he is self-aware enough to realize that more data is not more persuasive at some point, both because it becomes detached from life and because, as Bill said, people will then question the motives of the data giver before they will incorporate new data into their way of thinking. Y'all have heard very much in the last, I don't know how long, 10 years or more, about confirmation bias. You all have heard this term, that we will believe and even seek out information that supports what we already think before we will believe or seek out anything that makes us better informed. So we not only are biased, but we continue to deepen our bias by finding things that, and people, and even data, that already agree with us. And this way of approaching our thoughts does not lead to diversity or new ideas. It just entrenches us where we are and makes it much easier, if we're working in data and not story, to continue othering people, thinking of them as other, out there, away from us, even to the point that we don't think their lives have value or as much value as our own, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in the sermon today. And he gives the historic examples of huge movements that have othered and dehumanized. What can y'all think of in history? Who did this? Hitler. Yes, absolutely. The Nazi regime othered and dehumanized to the point of genocide. What else? Say it again. Apartheid, yes, devaluing human life. These people aren't people anymore or ever. Who?
Pol Pot.
Pol Pot. Yeah, you guys know your history. That's awesome. You were over there this summer. Yeah. This is actually a recurring pattern that tyrants have used across history to retain power, to even get one group of people to be allies and inflict violence on another group of people because they were no longer viewed as people, right? In ancient Rome, one of the most horrible punishments that was inflicted on people was to literally remove any history of that person. So to wipe out their memory, take them out of any documents, take them out of any official records, act as if they never existed, was the punishment, maybe worse than actual death, to be not human anymore. And y'all have seen this happen over and over again in history. And then Brooks, of course, turns us to how we can re-individuate, is his language. So if we have de-individuated, no longer seeing someone as an individual, how do we come back from that? How do we re-individuate so that we see each other? First is know the story. Tell your story. Listen to someone else's story. Brooks actually gives an assignment in this chapter. I didn't do it. Did you do it?
I didn't do it.
We won't tell him. We won't tell him on Thursday that we didn't do it. He talks about, probably you all have heard this somewhere else, I have, that Hemingway was once in an argument with somebody, I forgot who it was, but we can look it up in the book, about whether he could tell a complete story in 6 words. Have you all heard this example? And whoever it was arguing with Hemingway and gave him this challenge, and Hemingway said, no problem, I can write a complete story in 6 words. And the words are, for sale, baby shoes, unworn. Never used. That would be 2 words. Thank you. Unworn's 1 word. I did it in 5. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. Immediately, you just felt something. Immediately, I have chills, right? That 6-word story immediately connected us with emotion and heart and something in our own lives in just 6 words. So Brooks actually gives the assignment of trying something like that for ourselves, knowing enough about our own stories that we're able to quickly share them with others, and then leading, as we interact with other people, with the hope that we could hear their stories too. He says, try to write your own story in 12 words. And I didn't. Do you want... Velma did it, but she didn't save it. Terry. Oh, let me get you a microphone. I got it, Velma.
Thank you. The issue of having a give and take to establish an area that is equal to each other, that's sooner or later you're going to get to the point that you get down to the issue of disagreement, and a decision has to be made. How does tough love fit into this whole equation? I know anyone who's a parent knows what tough love is you make with children, but how does this go back to the issue of general relationships, the tough love issue?
So tough love is not one of his categories, but he very much believes in disagreement, Terry. So I'm glad you brought that up, because Arthur Brooks is not trying to move us toward a life where everyone is the same, thinks the same, and it's all just sort of washed out and grayed. He actually believes that disagreement is healthy and good, and that's a great segue into the next chapter, actually. But what he is concerned about is that we have lost the capacity to disagree and are living in a culture where we actually hate each other rather than loving each other and holding healthy and different views, particularly since disagreement can be a way of generating new ideas, of learning, right? Back to the problem of confirmation bias. It used to be that we all wanted to learn and to be expanded in our understanding versus I only want to hear things that I already think are true. Those are different. And he thinks disagreement gives us a much more creative and healthy culture if we can get to the place where we are seeing one another as humans worthy of love. So someone we love, sitting down and having a disagreement or just sharing different ideas with someone we love, healthy, seeing the fact that someone might disagree with us, and then turning to the idea that that person no longer has worth. That is the point of his book. He's trying to move us out of a culture of contempt. Good segue to the next chapter. Thanks, Terry. Go ahead.
Can I start?
Yeah.
The last chapter for today is competition. Our problem is the competition of ideas actually an issue. And he says, he walks through the example of sports. Do we think that competition is a problem in sports? Of course not. Of course we don't. You actually want to have competition and sets out rules. He first uses sports and then goes to ideas. So think of this in sports and see if it applies to ideas. Number one, competition breeds excellence. Can we agree with that in sports? Can we agree with that with ideas? Okay, hold on. We'll see. Because I'm going to give you a stat that's not even in the book. It's brand new. It came out last week, and we'll see what the United States thinks. True competition in sports requires rules. We can agree with that. Thank you, Jim Harbaugh. Or true competition in ideas requires rules, right? I mean, my living is people who are accused of breaking a rule or not, and then fighting it out before a judge to determine whether a rule was broken. Number three, mutual recognition of rules and compliance with them is actually a form of cooperation. Competition and cooperation are symbiotic. They are not mutually exclusive. And the last one, athletic competition unifies people through an addition of excellence, voluntary agreement on shared rules and shared experience. So again, how about ideas? Competition of ideas can unify people through an addition of excellence, voluntary agreement on rules. And then he has a quote. So those of you who have read this, you don't get to guess, although you can. And here's the quote as he applies this to ideas and to the free market. It says, the quote is, "The free market is the greatest producer of wealth in history. It has lifted billions out of poverty." And that did not come from a righty free market economist. You might know who that came from? Barack Obama said that. Barack Obama said that. And so it's this competition of ideas that are rules-based, that are not anonymous, I hate you, all right? Anonymity breeds contempt. But it is that competition that he says, like, if we can think about that in sports, but then move that to ideas, and then there is a free market that lifts all people, or at least has the ability to lift all people.
And he opens with sports as sort of a way to get us all in, I think, to this way of thinking. And he opens with the example, one of them, of women's hockey. Does anyone follow women's ice hockey? Did you know that there is women's ice hockey? So that exists, but here's part of the reason you haven't been following it and might not have known about it. For most of the history of women's ice hockey, there were exactly 2 teams. Who had the teams? Canada, obviously, and the United States had a really great team, and they just played each other over and over again. Canada winning most of the time, but the United States making a really solid showing in ice hockey. And what do you think happened if that's all we have? 2 teams. It's boring, first of all. Did anybody get any better? No. Could anyone else participate? No. Did this inspire anyone? No. So he uses this example as one that says there is a model for doing this generative idea kind of dialogue if we think about why we love sports. And we do love sports, right? If I said go Braves, what are y'all going to say? Go
Braves.
Braves. You could do better than that, but you're going to say, go Braves. Because we are united by that. We also are excited when our team is doing well, when our team is getting better, when our prospects are good. And who do we want to beat? Thank you, Esther. We want to beat whoever is the best. We actually want to be the best. We want to beat the next best. We want to engage a worthy and talented opponent because it makes us better. It makes them better. It's interesting, inspiring, and exciting. And so he translates all of that into the same with ideas. How do we actually want to talk and learn and grow and change? And isn't it boring if the only people we ever talk to or hear from say exactly the same thing we say, right? I think that would be boring, don't you all? Yeah. What questions do you have about this economy of ideas and even disagreement? Kurt.
How does the concept of a zero-sum game come into this? The idea that if you win, I lose. If you're economically successful, you're taking away from me. I've heard that a lot in the political world in the past 20 years, which I didn't hear a lot earlier. And that goes for social. You know, you take my freedom. I can't be free because you do something else. So it's both and.
Yeah, Bill, I'll let you go. There you go.
So on.
I was going to, but
He actually talks about that, and
Yeah.
he says, like, look, both well, I'll keep it in the political realm for a moment. Both parties are preaching on their extremes, are preaching that it is not both and, it is the either or, right? And he said, one, we talked a little bit about this, one is the politics of envy, the other is the politics of exclusion, right? And so they are both on the extremes, not coming together. I'll tell you this, one can disagree with the policy ideas. For example, I was watching the Republican debate this week. You can disagree with the policy ideas that are coming out of that debate, but the debate's so much better, right? I mean, it is actually hearing people talk on the right about what the right is believing without having the Trump, insults flying around. Put Vivek Ramaswamy aside for a moment, but who's trying to, be Trump Jr. But the quality of that debate is so much better than it was back the last time when we were having all of those Republicans out there debating. That's your alarm.
That's my alarm to go to church. See you in worship.
But we'll take it to the academic side, and he has a whole bunch in this book talking about why the polarization in academia and the refusal to let ideas come forward is just an incredible problem right now in academia. And I pulled out, this is the study that just came out last week. Nate Silver, you know Nate Silver, he used to be on the New York Times, a great political, uses data, crunches it, and he uses a study that just came out from a group called FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, which is a pro-free speech advocacy group that looks, it's sort of like I guess I'd call it the ACLU for universities, is what it sort of seems to be like. And they came out and looked at, they probably have more of a conservative bias, would be my guess, just reading the study, but it was interesting in talking about how ideas are being shut down on campus. And they look at free speech codes on campus and sort of the shutdown of debate, and then they go through and found that if they put forward what would be more, I'll let y'all see this study later, we don't have time to go into it all, but they put forward sort of ideas that would be more on the right and ideas that would be more on the left, and then put these questions to those who are on the right or left on college campuses to ask them if they would actually allow a speaker to come on campus to say these things. And then they rated the colleges according to their responses. And there's questions on transgenderism, abortion, Black Lives Matter. You might guess these are, would be viewed, sort of on the conservative side because it says would you have a speaker that says abortion should be completely illegal? Would you have a speaker who says Black Lives Matter is a hate group? And then had questions that are probably more on the progressive side. The Second Amendment should be repealed and all guns should be confiscated. Religious liberty is an excuse to discriminate against gays and lesbians. Structural racism maintains inequality while protecting white privilege. And goes through and says that, and it's on either side, although it's predominantly on the left, at least according to this study, they would refuse to have speakers come on campus to talk about those things. And then they rated the colleges according to, but it very quickly gets sort of 50-50, by the way, about, on the right and the left saying, no, I wouldn't have any of these speakers come, which is it just eviscerates this whole idea of the competition of ideas. I will say, part of the reason this was sent to me is because Washington and Lee University, where my daughter goes, was the number 2 most accepting school of either side's viewpoints of any school in the U.S. Hillsdale College was number 1, Washington and Lee, University of Chicago, Georgetown, Davidson. Those were the top schools in the country. And the worst were, then Harvard's like way, way down there low. Duke's not on this list, although I bet we can find it, Jim Blitch. But of all places, the University of Hawaii was the worst, which was odd. But anyway, but it is this whole idea of the competition of ideas. And Brooks cites the Proverbs and says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. But we have to listen with respect and not with contempt. I'll leave you with this John Stuart Mill quote, and then maybe we have time for a couple more questions. But John Stuart Mill, he cites, Mill says, to develop excellent ideas, we need competing ideas. That is why it is so this is actually the summary, not the Mill quote. Let me read the Mill quote, because it was actually really good. Mill says, it is impossible to overrate the value of placing human beings in contact with persons dissimilar to themselves and with modes of thought and action unlike those with which they are familiar. Such communication has always been, and is particularly in the present age, one of the primary sources of progress. But of course, the whole thing is about that discussion has to be without contempt. It has to be without treating the other as the other, and that is our challenge for us. Questions or thoughts before we roll into church? Well, come Thursday, big night, and then we'll do one wrap-up week next Sunday. So thanks, y'all.